The question that we're trying to answer here is, how has life progressed on Earth? How have we gotten from the beginning of life, something that looks like modern day bacteria, to the modern era of Snapchatting humans? So in this video, we're going to talk about the major events that we see in the history of life on Earth. We're not going to talk about all of them. We're just going to spotlight a couple of examples and some of the patterns that we see. If you look at this graph of Earth's history, you can see that most of the interesting stuff happens in the last quarter of Earth's history. It actually happens in the last half of the last quarter. That's this notion of accelerated returns in life's history. The idea that life starts slow after it originates, but then we hit these critical points by which the complexity and diversity of life increase exponentially. It's a totally natural thing to wonder, like, why is that the case? How come we didn't get complex multicellular life earlier on in Earth's history? Well, think about some of the things that had to evolve first. I mean, not even the origin of life, let's leave that aside. After the origin of life, you would need to get the evolution of photosynthesis in order to oxygenate the environment, and then the evolution of aerobic cellular respiration, which is the process that's used to generate the ATP that's used by all multicellular life on the planet. We would need to get the development of eukaryotes, and then we would need to get the organization of cells into multicellular organisms, and then we would need to get the development of the body plans that we see in multicellular organisms. All of these things have to get figured out before you can get the wide variety of multicellular life that we see on the planet today. And that helps to explain why we get this accelerated rate of increasing diversity as we get closer to present day in Earth's history. In other words, why all the multicellular stuff happens in the last billion years of Earth's life. Now, we could look at each of these, but that would make for a long video, and it's really beyond the level at which you need to know it for the purpose of this course. So I just want to focus on one thing here. I want to focus on the development of eukaryotes, which is a process that we refer to as endosymbiosis. So you can see that this process occurs somewhere around 2 billion years ago. That transition from prokaryotic cells without any internal membrane-bound organelles, to eukaryotic cells. A really important milestone in the history of life on Earth. Let's go and look at how we think that this happened. If we consider what life looked like before the origin of eukaryotes, everybody was a prokaryote. Some prokaryotes had evolved the ability to photosynthesize, and other prokaryotes had already evolved the ability to engage in aerobic cellular respiration. But many prokaryotes were still anaerobic. They didn't use oxygen in their respiration, and in order to make their living, they basically went out and they ate other organisms. It's thought that one group of these ancient anaerobic prokaryotes engulfed a group of prokaryotes that could carry out aerobic cellular respiration. And instead of digesting them and eating them, instead, over time, those internal aerobic prokaryotes evolved into modern-day mitochondria, which are the organelles present in all eukaryotes that are used for the process of aerobic cellular respiration. This gave rise, eventually, to all of the cells that are found in all of the animals on the planet, including you and me. But for a subgroup of these modern aerobic eukaryotes, they then engaged in an endosymbiotic process with another group of prokaryotes that had evolved the process of photosynthesis. And again, instead of digesting those prokaryotes, those photosynthetic prokaryotes became the modern-day chloroplasts and photosynthetic eukaryotes like plants and algae. This is the theory of endosymbiosis that we use to describe the origin of eukaryotes. Now, of course, I would hope that you would never accept something so fantastical without evidence to support it. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence that supports the endosymbiotic origins of mitochondria and chloroplasts. The first is that there are structural similarities between prokaryotes and mitochondria and chloroplasts. This is comparing a chloroplast, which is a photosynthetic organelle in eukaryotes, with a cyanobacteria, one of those groups of prokaryotes that can carry out photosynthesis. It turns out that they have internal structures that are very similar in terms of the organization of their internal membrane structures. They have their own ribosomes, they have their own DNA. When we look at the ribosomes in a mitochondria or a chloroplast, we see that those ribosomes are similar in structure to the ribosomes that we find in modern-day prokaryotes, and they actually differ from the ribosomes that we find in modern-day eukaryotes. And of course, the presence of an internal chromosome in mitochondria and chloroplasts means that we can sequence that internal chromosome and see which organisms they're most closely related to. The chromosomes of chloroplasts and mitochondria are not most similar to the DNA that's found in the nuclei of the eukaryotes that contain them. Instead, those chromosome sequences are most similar to the genomes that we find in two different groups of bacteria. Chloroplast genomes are most similar to cyanobacteria, and mitochondrial genomes are most similar to a group of bacteria called proteobacteria, which can carry out aerobic cellular respiration. Let's move on and look at some other patterns in life's history, particularly in the last 500 million years or so, the time period during which there have been macroscopic multicellular life forms on the planet. This is an interesting graph showing extinction intensity in different groups of marine organisms over time. And you can see that periodically over that course of time, we see spikes in the extinction rate. These events are generally referred to as mass extinctions, and there's a lot of debate in the scientific community over what caused them, but whatever the causes are, they had to have been pretty cataclysmic, like asteroids hitting the Earth. That last one over to the right, by the way, is the one that got rid of the dinosaurs. We also see patterns of radiation in life's history. The diversity of organisms that we see in the fossil record over time goes up and down in the short term, but in the long term is an undeniable trend towards maximizing the number of different types of organisms that we see on the planet, to the point where we are now living at a period of maximum biodiversity, the actions of humans notwithstanding. You may wonder why we get these radiations of life, and so I'll point you towards this concept from evolutionary biology known as an adaptive radiation. This refers to a rapid, and we put that in quotes because we're talking about geological time, right? So we're talking about tens of millions of years, but a rapid divergence in the forms of organisms that we see on the planet. Usually once there's the opportunity for life to diversify into a series of open niches. You can think about what happened to mammals after most of the dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, and how modern day mammals have diversified to fill a lot of niches that used to be filled by dinosaurs. Or you can think about the patterns that we see with organisms like Darwin's finches or other organisms when they arrive at isolated environments like islands where there are no organisms previously inhabiting these open niches. In both cases, the processes of evolution result in one organism giving rise to many diverse forms that come to occupy those empty niches. Of course, we'd be remiss here at the end if we didn't talk about patterns for life in the future. I'm sure it's obvious to you that the biggest deal for non-human life on this planet currently is dealing with the explosion in the human population, to the point where it's thought that perhaps we're living in a brand new geological era, which is sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene. This is an interesting graph that shows the percentage survival in large mammal species once humans arrived on the scene on 4 different areas of the planet. And you can see that every time humans arrived on the scene, the percentage of large mammal species in the area declined precipitously afterwards. And that is, of course, unfortunately, due to our activities in the environment and the way that we interact with the living systems of the world. All of that established, it's really difficult to reach any conclusions about how human activity is going to affect the evolution of life on Earth going into the future. Thanks so much for watching our discussion about life's history on Earth. Please make sure that you can do the following things here at the end. Make sure you can explain how we can investigate the events in life's history. Make sure you can explain the theory of endosymbiosis and provide examples of the evidence that supports it. And make sure that you can describe patterns in the extinction rate and radiations of life on Earth. If you can do those things, you're doing great. If not, that's okay too. Take a moment and write down any questions that you have so that you can get the answers that you need. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.